"You don't belong in this room." The words weren't shouted. They didn't have to be. They drifted across the grand ballroom with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime believing the world was divided into people who served and people who mattered. For a brief second, every conversation seemed to lose its voice. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm golden light across polished marble floors. A string quartet continued playing as if nothing had happened, and waiters carrying silver trays slowed their steps without realizing it. Naomi Brooks stood perfectly still beside the VIP table, her black server's uniform pressed neatly, a white linen napkin folded over one arm, and a single ivory envelope resting lightly in her hand. She had spent nearly 9 hours on her feet serving executives who barely looked at her face, memorizing drink orders before they were spoken, replacing empty glasses before anyone noticed, becoming invisible with the kind of quiet professionalism that only people in service truly understood. Tonight had been different from the beginning. Callahan Industries was celebrating its largest acquisition in company history, a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and every powerful name in Chicago seemed to be gathered beneath the soaring ceilings of the historic Grand Mercer Hotel. Expensive suits blended with designer gowns, champagne sparkled beneath the lights, and conversations floated through the room filled with stock prices, private jets, and vacation homes along the California coast. Naomi had heard all of it while carefully placing dinner plates on tables where no one ever asked for her name. She wasn't offended anymore. She had stopped expecting acknowledgement years ago. What surprised her was how easily people ignored the person standing only inches away from them. Richard Callahan was impossible to miss. At 56, the white-haired CEO carried himself with the calm confidence of a man who had never doubted that every door would open before he reached it. Even among governors, investors, and television personalities, he commanded the room without raising his voice. When he smiled, people laughed. When he frowned, conversations changed direction. Employees described him as brilliant. Financial magazines called him visionary. Those who worked closest to him whispered another word when he wasn't listening: untouchable. Naomi had watched him throughout the evening from a respectful distance. She noticed how he thanked billionaire donors, but never the servers who quietly kept the evening moving. She noticed how his eyes drifted past uniforms as though the people wearing them were simply another part of the hotel's furniture. Then, less than 5 minutes earlier, as she reached to refill his water glass, he had glanced at her only long enough to say, "Someone else can handle this table. She looks nervous." Several executives chuckled politely before returning to their conversations. Naomi hadn't answered. She simply stepped back, lowered her eyes, and continued doing her job. No anger, no embarrassment, just silence. Now she stood before him once again, but this time there was no tray, no glass of water, no dinner plate balanced carefully on her fingertips. Only the envelope. It looked ordinary, almost forgotten by time. Thick cream-colored paper, slightly worn corners, a faded blue wax seal that had cracked decades ago. Across the front, written in careful handwriting that had begun to fade with age, were 6 simple words: Richard Callahan. Deliver only if I never return. Naomi gently placed the envelope on the polished walnut table without saying another word. Richard's eyes drifted toward it almost absently. His expression remained unchanged for less than a heartbeat. Then the color quietly disappeared from his face. Richard Callahan did not touch the envelope immediately. His fingertips rested against the polished edge of the walnut table as though the distance of a few inches had suddenly become impossible to cross. Around him, investors continued discussing quarterly projections. Waiters replaced empty champagne flutes, and soft violin music floated beneath the enormous chandeliers. Yet none of those familiar sounds seemed to reach him anymore. Naomi Brooks quietly stepped back into the rhythm of the evening before anyone could stop her. She lifted another silver tray from the service station, adjusted the crisp white towel folded over her forearm, and resumed walking through the ballroom exactly as she had all night. To everyone else, she was simply another waitress doing her job. That was how life had trained her to survive. For years earlier, she had imagined something different. She had dreamed of becoming an elementary school teacher, believing that small acts of kindness could change the direction of a child's entire future. But dreams became expensive after her mother passed away, leaving Naomi and her grandmother alone in a modest apartment on the south side of Chicago. Medical bills piled higher than the rent. Tuition quietly disappeared behind grocery receipts, prescription bottles, and utility notices. Every decision became simple. Family first. Everything else later. Later somehow stretched into years. By day she worked shifts at a neighborhood cafe. 3 evenings each week she served banquets at the Grand Mercer Hotel because private corporate events paid several dollars more per hour. Every extra dollar mattered. Every overtime shift meant another prescription could be filled without worrying whether the lights would stay on at home. Yet no customer who watched her glide across marble floors balancing heavy trays could have guessed she still carried library books in her backpack, reading educational psychology during lunch breaks while other employees scrolled through their phones. She never complained. Complaints did not lower electric bills or refill refrigerators. Her grandmother, Eleanor Brooks, often smiled whenever Naomi apologized for working too much. Eleanor would simply squeeze her hand and say, "Character is what you choose when nobody is applauding." Naomi carried those words everywhere. She treated impatient guests with the same respect she offered the hotel dishwasher who always arrived before sunrise. She remembered birthdays, thanked kitchen staff by name, and slipped leftover dinner rolls into paper bags for the security guards finishing overnight shifts. Most people never noticed those small moments. She never expected them to. Earlier that afternoon, only hours before the gala began, Eleanor had asked for an old cedar box stored in the back of her bedroom closet. Dust covered the lid, and the brass latch resisted before finally opening with a quiet click. Inside rested yellowed photographs, faded Christmas cards, and a single unopened envelope sealed with cracked blue wax. Eleanor had stared at it for a long time before placing it carefully into Naomi's hands. Her voice had sounded softer than usual, almost carried away by memory. "If you ever meet Richard Callahan," she had whispered, "promise me you will give him this yourself. Do not leave it with an assistant. Do not mail it. Put it in his hands." Naomi had looked at the name written across the front, but asked no questions. Her grandmother had never spoken about the Callahan family before that afternoon. She only smiled with tired eyes and added one final sentence that stayed with Naomi through every hour of her shift. "Some promises take 30 years before they find the right door." Richard Callahan finally reached for the envelope, but before his fingers broke the aging wax seal, another executive leaned toward him with a smile that belonged on magazine covers rather than real conversations. "Richard, the press from Financial Business Weekly is ready whenever you are." Normally, he would have answered without hesitation. Interviews, negotiations, shareholder meetings, and billion-dollar decisions had shaped the rhythm of his life for more than 3 decades. He believed every minute should produce measurable results. Efficiency had built Callahan Industries from a regional manufacturing company into one of the largest engineering firms in the Midwest. Thousands of employees depended on decisions that flowed across his desk every morning before sunrise. His calendar was planned 6 months ahead. His private jet waited because time, in Richard's world, was always more valuable than comfort. Yet tonight, for reasons he could not explain, the envelope resting before him carried more weight than every contract stacked inside his office downtown. He stared at the handwriting again. It felt strangely familiar, like hearing the opening notes of a song remembered from childhood but forgotten for decades. Richard rarely thought about childhood anymore. Success had taught him that the past slowed people down. He preferred numbers over memories, forecasts over regrets, and performance over emotion. That philosophy had earned admiration from investors, but created distance from nearly everyone else. Employees respected him, yet few truly knew him. New hires learned quickly that excellence received recognition, while excuses disappeared into silence. Those who impressed him advanced rapidly. Those who did not often became invisible. Without realizing it, Richard had begun seeing entire groups of people the same way. Hotel staff, janitors, drivers, receptionists, dishwashers, and servers blended together into a single background that existed to keep his schedule running smoothly. He never considered himself cruel. He simply believed everyone occupied the place they had earned. If someone wanted a different life, they should work harder, study longer, and stop waiting for opportunity to arrive. It was a belief he repeated during interviews, leadership conferences, and university speeches. Audiences applauded every time. Nobody questioned the privilege hidden inside those polished words. Across the ballroom, Naomi quietly placed fresh coffee beside an elderly guest before helping another server collect empty dessert plates. She never once looked toward Richard's table again. That puzzled him more than the letter itself. Most people who approached powerful executives wanted something. A recommendation, a photograph, an investment, a second chance. She had asked for nothing. She had not even waited to see his reaction. It was as though delivering the envelope had completed a responsibility she had carried for someone else. Richard noticed another detail that suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Her expression had never contained fear. Not when he dismissed her earlier. Not when she approached his table. Not even when dozens of executives turned to watch her place the envelope before him. There had only been quiet certainty, the kind that came from fulfilling a promise rather than pursuing an ambition. Around him, applause erupted as the master of ceremonies welcomed guests to the stage for the evening's final presentation. Crystal glasses clinked together. Camera flashes reflected across polished marble pillars. Richard barely heard any of it. His thumb slowly traced the cracked edge of the blue wax seal. The paper felt older than it should have, almost fragile beneath his fingertips, as though time itself had been patiently protecting whatever waited inside until this exact moment. Richard inhaled slowly before sliding one finger beneath the brittle flap of the envelope. The blue wax seal gave way with a faint crack that sounded almost impossibly loud beneath the elegant music filling the ballroom. He unfolded a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, its edges softened by decades of careful storage. The handwriting was unmistakably familiar now. Every carefully formed letter pulled him backward through years he had buried beneath board meetings, quarterly reports, and impossible deadlines. His heartbeat slowed, then stumbled. He recognized the signature before he even reached the bottom of the page. Daniel Mercer. The name belonged to a man he had not spoken aloud in more than 30 years. Around him, applause erupted as another executive accepted an industry award on stage, but Richard heard none of it. His eyes remained fixed on the first sentence. If this letter ever reaches you, then I never found the courage to come back myself. Richard's fingers tightened around the paper. Daniel Mercer had once been a young engineer at Callahan Manufacturing when Richard was barely 23 years old, fresh out of college, and struggling to prove he deserved the family name that hung over every promotion. Daniel had been older, patient, respected by everyone on the factory floor, and one of the few employees who treated Richard like a young man instead of the owner's son. Richard remembered long afternoons walking through noisy assembly lines while Daniel explained machines that seemed impossibly complicated. He remembered laughter over paper cups of burnt coffee and conversations about responsibility, honesty, and earning respect instead of demanding it. Then, almost overnight, Daniel disappeared. Company records simply listed him as resigned. Richard never questioned it. His father discouraged discussion, saying only that some people made choices they later regretted. Richard accepted that explanation because it was easier than searching for another. Decades passed. The company expanded. His father died. Daniel slowly faded into a forgotten corner of memory until this letter quietly reopened a door Richard believed had been permanently sealed. Across the ballroom, Naomi carried a tray of fresh coffee toward another table where several guests thanked her with distracted smiles before returning to conversations about mergers and investment portfolios. She moved with the same calm grace she had shown all evening, never glancing toward Richard even once. She had fulfilled her grandmother's promise exactly as requested. Whatever happened next no longer belonged to her. Richard continued reading. Daniel's words spoke of regret, unfinished conversations, and a burden carried in silence for years. There was no bitterness in the handwriting, only an almost painful sincerity. Richard noticed tiny water stains near the middle of the page, as though someone had once folded the letter before tears had completely dried. He swallowed hard. The room suddenly felt warmer beneath the crystal lights. His expensive tailored jacket seemed strangely heavy across his shoulders. Every polished surface reflected celebration, success, and confidence. Yet the paper trembling lightly in his hands whispered about a forgotten chapter that refused to remain buried. Near the bottom of the first page, one sentence stopped him completely. There is a truth about the night your future changed forever, and if you are reading this, It is finally time for you to know what really happened. Richard's breathing became noticeably slower. Without realizing it, he lowered himself back into his chair as the sounds of celebration faded into a distant blur, and for the first time in many years, the man who had always believed he controlled every outcome realized that the next few lines might change everything he thought he knew about his own life. Richard's eyes moved slowly across the page, each sentence stripping away another layer of certainty he had carried for most of his life. Daniel's handwriting remained steady from beginning to end, as though every word had been weighed before touching the paper. He wrote about the accident inside the original manufacturing plant 32 years earlier, the equipment failure that nearly destroyed an entire production line, and the investigation that followed. Richard remembered standing outside the conference room while executives whispered behind closed doors. He remembered believing his father had protected the company through brilliant leadership. He remembered accepting that one trusted engineer had resigned after taking responsibility for a costly mistake. The letter revealed something entirely different. Daniel confessed that he had never caused the failure. He had accepted the blame because Richard's father begged him to do so, explaining that a public scandal involving the founder's only son would destroy the family's reputation and thousands of employees could lose their jobs. Daniel agreed on one condition. Richard was never to know. Your father cried when he asked me. The letter read. He promised he would tell you himself when the time was right. I believed him because I saw a frightened father, not a powerful businessman. Richard felt the room tilt ever so slightly. His late father had always appeared unshakable, a man whose confidence filled every room he entered. The thought of him pleading with an employee seemed impossible, yet every sentence carried the unmistakable weight of truth. Daniel continued, explaining that losing his position had been only the beginning. Other companies refused to hire an engineer whose name had become linked with negligence. His savings disappeared. His wife became ill. Pride kept him from returning to ask for help. Years passed before he learned that Richard had never been told the real story. By then, shame had become too heavy to overcome. Richard reached the final page with trembling hands. I never hated you, Daniel wrote. You were a good young man surrounded by difficult choices made by older people. If someone finally places this letter in your hands, please do not spend your future carrying the guilt that belonged to others. Instead, remember the people whose names history forgets while powerful men receive the applause. Richard lowered the paper just enough to look across the ballroom. Naomi was helping an elderly guest into a chair after noticing the woman searching for support. She adjusted the chair gently, offered a warm smile, and quietly returned to collecting empty plates before anyone thought to thank her. She had no idea what the letter contained. She could not have planned any of this. She had simply honored a promise made to her grandmother. Richard suddenly remembered Eleanor Brooks. The name surfaced from somewhere deep inside his memory. She had worked in the administrative office of the old factory during his first summer there. She always greeted employees with homemade cookies during the holidays and somehow remembered every birthday without writing any of them down. She and Daniel had often eaten lunch together in the courtyard beneath a large maple tree. Richard had not thought about either of them in decades. His chest tightened with a feeling he struggled to recognize. It was not fear. It was not grief alone. It was the realization that while he had spent years believing success was built only by extraordinary leaders, countless ordinary people had quietly sacrificed pieces of their own lives so that his future could remain untouched. And standing only a few yards away was the granddaughter of one of those forgotten people, still wearing a server's uniform, still moving through the room unnoticed by almost everyone except him. For several long moments, Richard did not move. The applause echoing from the stage faded into the background until it sounded no louder than distant rain against a window. The orchestra continued its elegant melody. Crystal glasses caught the golden light overhead, and conversations resumed around him, but the celebration no longer belonged to him. It belonged to a world he suddenly realized had been built upon stories he had never bothered to hear. He carefully folded the letter along the same worn creases that had protected it for more than 3 decades. His fingertips lingered on the faded signature before he slipped the pages back into the envelope with a level of care he had not shown anything in years. Across the ballroom, Naomi quietly thanked another server for helping clear a table before lifting a stack of neatly folded linens from a service cart. She smiled at a dishwasher emerging from the kitchen doors, exchanged a few kind words with the hotel's elderly florist, and continued moving through the room with the same quiet grace that had defined her entire evening. Nothing about her behavior suggested she expected recognition. Nothing hinted that she had just changed the course of another person's life. Richard watched her in silence. Earlier that night, he had looked straight through her, seeing only a uniform instead of a human being. Now every small gesture seemed impossible to ignore. She noticed empty coffee cups before guests asked for refills. She slowed her pace whenever an older visitor crossed the marble floor. She quietly straightened a chair left out of place so no one would stumble over it later. The details were almost invisible unless someone chose to pay attention. Richard realized he had spent years surrounded by people like Naomi without truly seeing any of them. Success had taught him how to read financial statements in minutes, negotiate impossible contracts, and predict market trends before competitors reacted, yet somehow it had never taught him to notice the dignity carried by the people serving his dinner. The realization settled over him with surprising weight. He glanced once more at the envelope resting against his palm. Eleanor Brooks had guarded this truth for decades without demanding recognition. Daniel Mercer had sacrificed his own future while asking for nothing in return. Naomi had delivered both of their legacies without expecting gratitude, money, or opportunity. She had simply kept a promise. Richard lowered his eyes toward the polished walnut table, where the ballroom lights reflected like soft stars across the glossy surface. For the first time in years, he saw his own reflection without the comforting shield of titles, awards, or headlines. He saw a man who had inherited more than success. He had inherited silence, assumptions, and a version of history that had protected his comfort while burying someone else's sacrifice. A server quietly placed fresh coffee near his elbow, asking softly whether he needed anything else. Richard looked up with gentle surprise. It was another employee whose name he had never learned despite attending events at the hotel for nearly a decade. He offered a quiet thank you, and the young man blinked with visible surprise before smiling and walking away. It was a small moment, almost insignificant compared to the truth hidden inside the envelope, yet it felt like the first honest conversation Richard had experienced all evening. His gaze returned to Naomi as she disappeared briefly through the kitchen doors before emerging again beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. She still believed her responsibility had ended when she placed the envelope on his table. Richard slowly rose from his chair, holding the letter close against his chest, knowing with absolute certainty that before this night was over, he needed to speak to the woman whose quiet integrity had accomplished what power, wealth, and influence never could. She had reminded him that the greatest truths rarely arrived through boardrooms or headlines. Sometimes they arrived carried by the hands of the person everyone else had chosen not to see. Richard took one slow step away from the VIP table, then another, hardly noticing the surprised expressions on the faces of executives who instinctively moved aside to let him pass. He had been expected on stage in less than 2 minutes to deliver the closing remarks of the evening, but for the first time in anyone's memory, the schedule no longer mattered to him. His eyes searched the ballroom until they found Naomi arranging folded linen napkins near the entrance to the banquet hall. She worked with the same quiet concentration she had shown all night, unaware that one of the most influential men in the room was walking directly toward her. A few guests noticed the unusual sight and gradually lowered their voices. Richard Callahan rarely approached anyone without a purpose, and he had certainly never crossed an entire ballroom to speak with a waitress. Naomi sensed someone stop beside her and turned politely, expecting another request for coffee or dessert. Instead, she found Richard standing only a few feet away, the aged envelope still resting carefully in his hands. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The silence felt strangely peaceful despite the elegant celebration continuing around them. Finally, Richard broke it with a voice quieter than anyone nearby had ever heard from him. "Miss Brooks, did your grandmother ever tell you what was inside this letter?" Naomi gently shook her head. "No, sir. She only told me that if I ever met you, I had to place it in your hands personally. She said promises lose their meaning when someone else finishes them for you." Richard lowered his eyes for a moment. absorbing the simple wisdom hidden inside her answer. "So you never opened it?" Naomi smiled softly. "It was not my story to read." Those words settled over Richard with even greater force than the letter itself. He had spent years protecting confidential documents worth billions of dollars. Yet this young woman had protected another person's private truth for decades simply because she believed it belonged to someone else. Nearby, two board members exchanged puzzled glances. A television reporter quietly lowered her microphone, sensing something far more important than a corporate speech unfolding before her. Richard looked back at Naomi. "Your grandmother worked with Daniel Mercer, did she not?" Naomi nodded. "They remained friends until he passed away. She visited him every Christmas. After he died, his daughter gave my grandmother that letter because she believed someday she might meet you before anyone else did." Richard closed his eyes briefly. Every missing piece was beginning to fit together with painful clarity. Eleanor had never sought recognition. Daniel had never defended himself. His own father had carried guilt into the end of his life without finding the courage to reveal the truth. Only now, through the quiet faithfulness of a granddaughter who had never even met Daniel, had the story finally reached its rightful destination. Richard looked around the ballroom once more. The executives, investors, and honored guests suddenly appeared different to him. He wondered how many unseen sacrifices rested quietly behind every polished success in the room. How many receptionists had stayed late without credit? How many maintenance workers had prevented disasters no one ever noticed? How many parents had postponed their own dreams so their children could chase something brighter? He returned his attention to Naomi, his expression no longer carrying the distance that had defined him only an hour earlier. There was humility there now, and gratitude that could not be measured on any financial statement. For the first time since entering the Grand Mercer Hotel that evening, Richard saw not a waitress standing before him, but a woman whose integrity had quietly preserved another family's truth across an entire generation, asking nothing in return except the chance to keep a promise. Richard drew a slow breath before speaking again, and although his voice remained calm, it carried a sincerity that instantly quieted the small circle of people who had gathered nearby. "I owe you an apology," he said, looking directly at Naomi instead of beyond her as he had done earlier that evening. "Not because you delivered this letter, but because before tonight I failed to see the person standing in front of me." Naomi remained composed. She did not appear triumphant or resentful. She simply listened with the same quiet attentiveness she had shown every guest throughout the evening. Richard continued, "When you approached my table, I saw a uniform instead of a life. I saw a role instead of a name. That was my failure, not yours." The words seemed to hang beneath the chandeliers longer than anyone expected. Several executives who had witnessed Richard dismiss Naomi earlier exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some lowered their eyes toward their untouched coffee cups. Others silently reflected on the countless service workers they had overlooked during the evening. Naomi answered gently, "My grandmother always believed people can change when they are willing to listen. That is why she never let bitterness become part of her story." Richard looked down at the envelope resting in his hands before carefully offering it toward her. "I think your family protected something priceless." Naomi smiled softly, but did not take the letter. "No, sir. It belongs with you now. We were only keeping it safe until the right time." Her response caught him by surprise once again. There was no desire to claim recognition, no request for compensation, no expectation of reward. Only peace. Richard slowly lowered the envelope and nodded with quiet understanding. "Then I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of receiving it." The master of ceremonies approached cautiously, reminding Richard that hundreds of guests were waiting for his closing address. Richard thanked him, then turned toward the stage. For a brief moment he paused, looking back at Naomi, who had already reached for another stack of clean plates, preparing to continue her shift as though nothing extraordinary had happened. That simple act affected him more deeply than any standing ovation ever had. He walked onto the stage without the confident stride that usually accompanied public appearances. Instead, there was humility in every measured step. The audience welcomed him with warm applause, expecting another polished speech about growth, innovation, and future investments. Richard stood behind the podium, looked across the ballroom, and then quietly set the old envelope beside the microphone where everyone could see it. "Tonight," he began, I was reminded that success is never built by one person alone. The room became still. Every company has people whose names never appear in annual reports. They prepare meals, clean floors, answer phones, repair equipment, welcome strangers, and keep promises long after everyone else has forgotten them. Too often, people like me accept their dedication without truly seeing them. His eyes found Naomi near the back of the ballroom. She immediately looked away, uncomfortable with attention. Richard smiled with quiet gratitude before continuing. Leadership is not measured by how many people work for you. It is measured by how many people you choose to value. The applause that followed sounded different from the celebration earlier that evening. It was slower, warmer, more thoughtful. Yet the person receiving the loudest praise never stepped onto the stage. Naomi quietly carried another tray toward a table of guests, offering each person the same respectful smile she had shared all night, proving once again that true character does not become greater when the world finally notices it. It simply continues doing what is right. The ballroom slowly emptied as the evening drew to a close. One by one, luxury sedans disappeared into the quiet Chicago night, their headlights reflecting across rain-polished streets, while hotel employees began the familiar routine of restoring the grand hall to silence. Crystal glasses were collected, white tablecloths folded with practiced hands, and fresh flowers carefully lifted from the centerpieces that had dazzled hundreds of guests only hours before. Naomi tied the strings of her apron, gathered the last stack of neatly folded linens, and thanked each member of the banquet staff before clocking out. To her, it had simply been another long shift, except that one promise her grandmother had carried for more than 30 years had finally reached its destination. She stepped through the revolving front doors into the cool evening air, pulling her light jacket a little closer as a gentle breeze carried the scent of rain and the distant sound of city traffic. Behind her, the towering hotel glowed with warm golden light against the dark sky. She paused for a brief moment, smiled quietly to herself, and began walking toward the nearby train station, believing the story had ended exactly where it was supposed to. Inside the nearly empty ballroom, Richard remained standing alone long after every executive had left. The old envelope rested carefully inside his suit jacket, close to his heart rather than inside the leather briefcase that usually carried the documents shaping billion-dollar decisions. He slowly walked across the polished marble floor, stopping beside the service station where Naomi had spent most of the evening. A clean coffee cup sat upside down on the counter. A neatly folded towel rested beside it. Nothing extraordinary remained, yet somehow the room felt completely different. He finally understood that the most important conversation of the night had not happened beneath the spotlight on stage. It had happened quietly between two people standing beside a banquet table while almost everyone else looked the other way. Early the following morning, before the sun reached the glass towers of downtown Chicago, Richard instructed his executive assistant to locate every surviving employment record connected to Daniel Mercer and Eleanor Brooks. He also ordered a review of the company's employee recognition programs, scholarship initiatives, and frontline workplace policies. For the first time in years, the agenda for the weekly leadership meeting did not begin with revenue projections. It began with one handwritten sentence he copied from Daniel's letter onto the first page of his notebook. Remember the people whose names history forgets. Weeks later, a modest scholarship fund was established in honor of Daniel Mercer and Eleanor Brooks to support students pursuing careers in education and engineering while working to support their families. Richard never announced that the idea had come from a waitress. He believed some acts of kindness became even more meaningful when they were not claimed for applause. Naomi continued working while taking evening classes toward the teaching degree she had postponed years earlier. She accepted the scholarship only after learning that dozens of other students would receive the same opportunity. Nothing about her life changed overnight except one quiet detail. Whenever she passed through the lobby of the Grand Mercer Hotel, the executives who once looked through her now greeted her by name. Months later, Richard happened to see her leaving the building with a backpack filled with textbooks instead of serving trays. Their eyes met for only a moment. Neither spoke. They simply exchanged a warm smile that needed no explanation. Some stories end with revenge. Others end with victory. This one ended with something far more enduring. A forgotten promise was finally kept, A hidden truth finally found its rightful home, and two strangers walked away carrying a deeper understanding that dignity has never depended on wealth, position, or the color of someone's skin. It begins the moment one person chooses to truly see another.